Hello again, it's Joe V from 4x5 Photography. Welcome to the third in our series of making better negatives than old Ansel himself. If you've been watching the other videos, you know we've been working through Ansel's process, and this video really covers the last major element, the last major process that he would apply in basically exposing film to capture the image that he wanted. And this final element is really the element that throws off our ability to apply his techniques and develop more than one sheet at a time. So let's get right into it.
Expose for the shadows and develop for the highlights. It's about time this joker got to the important part. I wonder if he's gonna get it right. Let's watch and see.
Alright, so we're looking again here at a picture from Ansel's book, The Negative. And this is his representation of the zone system. Again, as a quick recap, it goes from zone 0, pure black, to zone 10, pure white, and sitting right in the middle here is zone 5, the middle gray zone, which is what he would use, and as we saw in the previous video, to meter and then place elements of his image within the lower portion here to expose for the shadows. And so let's take an example of where Ansel would have metered an area of his image and determined that he wanted that at zone 4. And so he would meter, it would give him the exposure at zone 5. He'd want that to be at zone 4, so he would reduce the exposure by one stop. Remember, each zone is separated by one stop. And so that's all well and good, but again, that's only half of the equation that old Ansel gave us. So that would take care of exposing for the shadows. The problem is, though, when he reduced that exposure, something in his image that was sitting at zone 6 that he may have wanted at zone 6 would also be reduced by one stop. So those portions of his image that were at 6, 7, 8, 9, or even 10, all of those would have the same resulting impact of exposing at one stop less than where he metered. And so something at zone 6 obviously would go to zone 5, 7 to 6, and so forth. And that may be okay, but maybe not, because Ansel may have decided that an area of his image that was at zone 6, he wanted to stay at zone 6. And so there we have the second part of our equation. Expose for the shadows and then develop for the highlights. And so in this example, he would set his exposure for placing that element of his shadow at zone 4, and he would then mark in his notebook that this film needed to be developed as normal plus 1. And what that meant was, while the shadow was placed here correctly, the elements of his image that were at zone 6 would be exposed and would be captured at zone 5. And so he would have to vary the development to put it back at zone 6. And so he would, in this example, have written in his notebook that this particular image needed to be developed as normal plus one stop, or n plus 1. And so by doing that, then, we'll talk a little bit about exposure in a minute, development in a minute. He will have a special formula or a special recipe for this image where the exposure placed the shadows within the lower portion of the zone system where he would want it to be. He would have exposed to get tone and texture for the element of the image or the shadow that he wanted. That would have had the same impact to highs, reducing them by however many stops he reduced, or increasing them by however many stops he increased to capture the shadows correctly. And however many stops would vary from middle gray that he would change his exposure, that's what he would record with his film. So if he exposed at middle gray and there was a part of his image that he was looking at which really needed to be in zone 3, let's say, then he would set his exposure 2 stops less, obviously. That would take something at zone 6 and move it back 2 stops, placing it at zone 4, far too dark. So to put it back at 6, that example would have been normal development plus 2.
Not too shabby. one thing to remember is I would also meter at the highs. So not only would I check the lows to put them on the right zone, but I would use my spot meter to find the area of the image that I would want to also have tone and texture at the high end. And then I would meter that to determine what kind of development time I would have.
Alright, so let's bring Ansel's process home here, and let's go back to where we started, where we have a sheet of film and we've got a development tray, and we talked about how Ansel would develop one sheet at a time, and what we've gone through up to this point really tells you why he needed to develop one sheet at a time. Because each sheet for each image, he would record the recipe. He would have exposed for the shadows, and then if he needed to adjust for the higher elements of his image, n+1, n+2, and -1, whatever it would be, he would have recorded that in his notebook. Now, what Ansel knew is, like what I know, is for the film that I develop, I know how long normal development time is for this film. It happens to be 9.5 minutes. And for me, for what I believe it to be. And I've done testing on my film to know how much time I have to vary development for each stop. So during that time, while a piece of film sits in the developer, for every minute that it's in there, or every 30 seconds, so much of that image is going to be developed, obviously. And so time can equate to numbers of stops for development. And so if Ansel had recorded that this image was to be developed at n+2, so for example, for this film, I would determine how many stops, how long the film would have to sit in there for one extra stop of development time. I'd multiply that times 2, and I would keep the film in the developer that much longer. And so remember, again, back to where we started, we talked about how when you develop film, the darker portions of the image develop quicker and then slow with development time. So they get darker faster, but then they only increase over time while they're in the developer a short amount. Whereas the highs, the longer they're in development, the farther down the zone scale that they will come. So something that may be at zone 9, for example, at normal development time, if I leave it in enough time to develop one more stop, then it would be at zone 8, and so forth. And so that's how Ansel would expose for the shadows and develop for the highs. And every sheet of film that he had, unless it was just normal development time, in other words, he put the shadows where he wanted them in the zone system and everything else in his image fell into place, normal development time. If it wasn't that, then every sheet of film would have his recipe from what he understood it to be at the moment that he captured his image. And so he couldn't combine films that were n+1 with films that were n+2 or n-1, whatever his recipe was, because that became just too much to keep track of with all this film shuffling in through the developer. And therein lies the final element of how Ansel defined and used the zone system. And because of that n+ or n- development, because of that part of the recipe that allowed him to develop for the highs, we can't develop film multiple sheets at a time. So our challenge, if we are going to develop, at least the way I develop, where we don't have the time or energy to be able to do one sheet at a time and to be able to expose the film with this whole approach and mechanism that Ansel defined with the zone system, we have to modify our approach. We always have to drive towards a standard development time for all of the sheets that we put into our developer, because we're using daylight processing and we're developing more than one sheet at a time. And so for me, what I always do is I expose for normal development time. And in the final part of this series, I'm going to go through a number of exposure techniques. Again, these videos are really for folks who want to get into and understand large format photography. There are many different processes and mechanisms that you can use to develop film when you're developing multiple sheets at a time. But my goal is to get these videos out there so that you, the beginner or somebody who's into photography and hasn't had an experience yet with film and is interested, has a real good starting point and reference to work from. So the final video, I hope you watch it too. It's going to be on a handful of techniques that you can use to properly capture the image that you want and to expose your film so that you can use normal development time, whatever that may be for whatever film you're using, to be able to get the image that you want or an image very close to what you're looking for. So again, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you click the subscribe button. My goal with these videos is to really take you through the whole process from loading film to creating an image in the darkroom. And that's the goal of this channel. So I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you keep watching.